Welcome to the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission's courageous conversation this morning. I want to make note that this is the 11th time we've worked in a very valued partnership with Congregation Agudas Israel from Saskatoon in commemorating Raoul Wallenberg Day. I want to thank Jan Gitlin, Ron Gitlin, and Heather Fenyas for their continuous contribution to make this important day a very big success. Now, today we're welcoming many visitors. We have school children from the Saskatoon Public Schools, the Saskatoon Catholic Schools, and their teachers, many teachers. We have members of the Saskatchewan human rights community, and we have some special guests, two rabbinical scholars. We have Rabbi David Englander from Florida in the United States, and we have Rabbi Claudio Jordakovsky from the Congregation Agudas Israel. I also want to mention that we have today Sherwood and Elaine Scharf, generous philanthropists whose cornerstone donation to the Consensus Citizenship Education Foundation has allowed thousands of Saskatchewan students and teachers to understand and learn the responsibilities of being a Canadian citizen, primarily that we have a fundamental duty to respect every citizen without exception, and every student has a duty to make the world a better place. I want to thank Erwin Kotler, an international champion for human rights, certainly well known in Canada and internationally. He's the former Minister of Justice for Canada. And I want to thank members of the Raoul Wallenberg Centre for Human Rights for joining us today, many people from across Canada, and Heather Fenyas' friends from coast to coast. So yesterday, January 17th, was the 20th anniversary of Raoul Wallenberg Day, commemorated by the Government of Canada. Raoul Wallenberg is Canada's first honorary citizen. He was made an honorary citizen in 1985. Raoul Wallenberg was a Swedish diplomat whose courage and selfless determination helped save tens of thousands of Jewish lives in Nazi-occupied Hungary in the Second World War. He's been called the greatest humanitarian of the 20th century by the United Nations. Wallenberg was a ray of hope in the darkest hours of the Holocaust. While his fate remains unknown, he has a legacy and it lives on. That's what we're celebrating today and commemorating his good work. It reminds us of the power of one person to make a difference. His legacy reminds us that each and every citizen has the power, the responsibility to stand up to injustice, inequality, hate, prejudice, and racism in all its forms. The example of Raoul Wallenberg is so desperately needed in this time, the times we live in, where we see the rise of nationalism, authoritarianism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism in Canada and throughout the Western world. Today, we are honored to have with us two very esteemed presenters. The ambassador to Canada from Sweden, Urban Ahlin, and Heather Fenyas, an educator, a community builder, and a champion for human rights in Canada. I'll give a more formal introduction shortly. The format today will be that Ambassador Ahlin will speak first, and then I'll introduce Heather Fenyas, and then there'll be questions and answers available. And you can, on the chat side of the screen, you can tender your questions, and those questions will be monitored by Adam Hobble of the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission. So with that, now I formally introduce to you Mr. Urban Ahlin, the ambassador for Sweden to Canada. He's been the ambassador since February of 2019. Prior to his appointment as an ambassador, Mr. Ahlin was a politician representing the Swedish Democratic Party. From 2014 to 2018, Urban Ahlin held the position of Speaker of the Swedish Parliament. He was a member of Parliament for 24 years and a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee at various times in his parliamentary career. He was also the founding member of the first pan-European think tank, the European Council on Foreign Affairs. He is a teacher, and he graduated from the University of Karlstad with a master's in science in education. With that, I welcome our esteemed guest, Ambassador Aline.
Thank you very much, David. First, I need to correct you, though. I was representing the Swedish Social Democratic Party. The Swedish Democratic Party is a totally different breed. So I want everyone to know that I was representing the Social Democratic Party in Sweden. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure for me to be here commemorating Raoul Wallenberg. And my name is Urban Aline. As David said, I'm a pretty new ambassador here to Canada. And as David said, before that, I was working as a politician back home in Sweden. And it's a great honor for me to be with you today, commemorating outstanding Swedish diplomat. Around 40 years ago, the Swedish ambassador to Canada was Per Anger. And he was sitting in the same residence as I am doing now. About 40 years earlier, he had actually been working together with Raoul Wallenberg in Budapest. So it's a connection between Sweden and Canada and what Raoul Wallenberg did in Budapest, because Per Anger was working hand in hand with Raoul Wallenberg in distributing skyddspass to Jews that could, save them from the atrocities and the Holocaust, because he was handing out this skyddspass to people that needed it. And I know that Heather will talk a lot more about that later on. And Per Anger, working together with Wallenberg, told Wallenberg the 10th of January 1945, you need to go home. It's getting dangerous here in Budapest. So I really think you should go back to Stockholm and seek shelter. And Wallenberg told him, to me, there is no other choice. I have accepted this assignment and I could never return to Stockholm without the knowledge that I had done everything in human power to save as many Jews as possible. That was Wallenberg's response to Per Anger in January 1945. 7 days later, Raoul Wallenberg was called to the Soviet troops and Soviet forces in Budapest. And after that meeting, he has never returned. And still, we don't know what happened to him. We only know he was arrested, he was brought to Moscow, and we have never heard from him again. Per Anger had done lots of work for the Swedish-Canadian relationship, and he has also been one of the important factors why Canada is having Raoul Wallenberg as its first honorary citizen. And of course, the whole idea behind that is that we should cherish the memory of Raoul Wallenberg's important work and the good deeds. And remember that we should not only remember Raoul Wallenberg as a sad memory of the Holocaust and the enormous atrocities of the Nazis in Germany and in Europe. We should also remember it as an inspiration for us to good deeds, because that's what Raoul Wallenberg work was all about. That was that we need to fight anti-Semitism, we need to fight racism, we need to fight discrimination, we need to fight sexism, we need to see all the human beings for what they are, human beings. And I don't know if you have been to Yad Vashem, the museum in Jerusalem showing the Holocaust. It's a wonderful museum. It's terrifying, but it's a wonderful museum at the same time. You walk in and you start to learn how the Nazis were dehumanizing the Jews, telling them pigs, saying they were cockroaches, they were rats. And that was an idea that the Nazis had, that to have their final solution, as they called it, to fulfill the Holocaust of the Jews, they needed to dehumanize the Jews, not treating them as human beings. And we need to learn from that, all of us, that as soon as we see or hear someone talking about another human being as it was not a human being, we need to say enough. We need to say stop. And I know that there are lots of students now watching this program. And if you really want to go in the footsteps of Raoul Wallenberg, it's enough if you just, when you hear someone saying something racist or something discriminatory, it's enough if you say, no, stop there. You don't do that. We are all human beings on this planet and we need to treat each other as human beings. As the Speaker of the Swedish Parliament, I had the honor to have a room in the Swedish Parliament that we call the Raoul Wallenberg room, or also the room of good deeds. The US Congress actually gave posthum a congressional gold medal to Raoul Wallenberg. And the Raoul Wallenberg family deposited this gold medal to the Swedish Parliament. So every student, every visitor to the Swedish Parliament goes through the room of good deeds, just to show what Wallenberg did and also learn that we all need to be part of that and doing good deeds. So please, don't remember Raoul Wallenberg just as a sad memory of the Holocaust. Remember him as an inspiring thing for doing good deeds. It's good enough if you just say stop when you hear people saying something racist, discriminatory, or something like that. Stand up for the human rights. That's the best way we can commemorate Raoul Wallenberg's work. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm now going to introduce Heather Fenyas, who is a dedicated community builder who tirelessly facilitates conversations on topics such as racism, conciliation. She's designed a number of these conversations, and she brings all perspectives. She's committed herself and her time to her energies in promoting and implementing programs and educational opportunities for both adults and children, with the aim to eliminate racism and foster civics and social responsibilities. Heather is the past president of the Congregation Agudas Israel Synagogue, a co-founder of Think Good, Do Good here in Saskatchewan, a member of the Consensus Citizenship Education Foundation Board of Directors. Heather also serves on the national boards, which include the Canadian Jewish Political Affairs Committee of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, the Jerusalem Foundation, and the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. Heather has a story to tell you, which is very personal, very compelling, and I know will bring tears to your eyes. Heather.
Thanks, David. Thank you all for coming in today. I'd like to give an especially big welcome to the students watching. I'm sorry not to be in a school as I usually am for this, to see your faces and interact with you personally. Raoul Wallenberg's message of the power of one transcends age and time. I'm grateful each January to pause and consider his efforts through my own personal lens. We all process life experiences through a multitude of lenses. Just like a pair of sunglasses specifically designed to filter more or less sun and alter our vision accordingly, our lenses bias how we organize information. Some of us prioritize our personal politics of the lens, and our place on that spectrum largely filters our worldview. For others, our institutional or individual religious beliefs offer a scaffolding and perspective. Maybe we use historical events to classify news in the present, whether genocide, institutional racism, or our own cultural realities. All of these may be the sunglasses that darken or brighten our view. Education, arguably our strongest lens, its quality and quantity, consciously and subconsciously shapes our thoughts and convictions. Layer on each of these lenses our stories of survival, loss, or achievement, and we each have a complex filtration system. And now the entire world has another set of lenses that we haven't properly adjusted to, through which we filter our perceptions: the pandemic, its disproportionate and catastrophic impact over the globe, the Black Lives Matter call to action and all that it implies, and the seemingly fragile democracy that sometimes feels as if it's unraveling right below us. The irony is not lost on me that despite humanity in possession and civilization in possession of the most compassionate and clear lenses than ever before in history, we seem unable to find even one that clarifies just enough to learn from our past and build self-sustaining, truly healthy communities. This morning, as much as possible, I'd like to invite you to put aside your personal lenses and hear this story through the eyes of one. For me, Raoul Wallenberg and his astonishing acts of heroism will always be viewed through the 8-year-old innocent eyes of a little girl named Marika. In March of 1944, Marika's life had been dominated by war, but living in Budapest, and moreover on the affluent side of the river Buda, she still enjoyed some carefree moments. Marika tells me that children of her generation were, and I have to say this in a Hungarian accent, were real childrens, with more innocence and wonder than today's tech-savvy 8-year-olds. She believes her memories, or lack thereof, is in part because she was just busy being a child. While Hitler had already ravaged and murdered Jews all over Europe, Hungary remained relatively untouched. Marika lived in a loving and close family of 4, with her parents and her older brother, Rudy. They owned a modern home with hot water and a bathtub, luxuries for many at the time. They were city folks, celebrating Jewish and secular holidays, keeping kosher, and very much connected to their Jewish and local community. Marika's dad, Sándor, was a tailor. He and Marika's mom had a stall in a flea market where he made men's clothing. They were able to enjoy a life of happiness and relative luxury. Marika tells me that while they enjoyed and experienced freedoms long lost to Jews over much of the continent, their lives began to slowly unravel before Hitler's army occupied Hungary. For one, a number of her father's relatives lived hidden in her home, forced into a wardrobe every time that there was a knock on the door. These were Polish cousins, aunts, and uncles who had escaped their cities and the roundups that had sent most of the Polish Jews already to death camps. Marika remembers from this point on, she didn't play with her friends. Her parents worried their hidden relatives would be discovered and taken away. She doesn't remember details, but clearly recalls that they were picked up by the Hungarian Arrow Cross, kind of Hungary's Nazi officers, once and returned, and again a second time. Only this time they didn't return. They went on a one-way ride to Auschwitz gas chamber. I especially love listening to Marika's memory of learning to ride a bike. I think it's one we can all relate to, in part. She recalls the ecstasy of the moment she took flight, connecting to how euphoric she felt. She shouted to her father, first in glee and then in fear, as she lost control and barreled into a strange man. At the time, Marika didn't understand her father's panic-stricken reaction. Her parents had tried to shelter her from the hatred of Jews that had poisoned many of their neighbors and friends. Her father, fearing any interaction with a stranger could jeopardize their safety, scooped up Marika, and she never rode her bike with him again. While Marika was just learning to ride a bike, Raoul Wallenberg was still living in Sweden. In June of 1944, he was sent to Hungary as a recent recruit of the War Refugee Board and given the status of Swedish diplomat, as we've heard. He was sent to save Hungarian Jews. Before Wallenberg arrived, Marika's life changed dramatically. Her father, Sándor, was taken away as a slave laborer. Her mother, Margit, was told they needed to leave their home. All Jews in Budapest were expected to live in one of a very few designated apartment buildings. She found a non-Jewish family very happy to make the trade from their awful, cramped apartment in exchange for Marika's beautiful one. Just before the switch was set to happen, the government reassigned Marika's as a Jewish building, but her family's relief was short-lived. The residents of the other apartment threatened to call the Gestapo, the Nazi police, and have Marika and her whole family sent to the death camp of Auschwitz if they didn't leave. Well, at first, Margit ignored their threats. It ended abruptly, and in the middle of the night, with the other family pounding on Marika's door, giving them only hours to leave. At this time, Marika's older brother, Rudy, was very sick with scarlet fever. If the threat of the Gestapo wasn't quite enough, the family from the other apartment called an ambulance early in the early morning hours, and without Margit's permission, Rudy was taken away, and nobody knew where. Marika remembers arriving at the apartment that day with her mother. It was small and cramped and packed with families. Much to little Marika's shock, the very next day, her mother left in search of Rudy. Margit, at risk to her whole family's safety, removed the yellow star from her clothing that all Jews were required to wear. She took off the money belt she wore at all times and left 8-year-old Marika at home alone. Marika doesn't know how long, she doesn't recall how long her mother was gone. All she remembers is terror. The gripping memory is as real to Marika today as it was almost 80 years ago. So blocked by trauma, she doesn't remember how she ate, and probably she suspects she received bits of food from neighbors. 4, maybe 5 days later, Margit returned home. She paid a bribe to the officer, and Marika understood why the money belt had been left behind. A different outcome. Meanwhile, Raoul Wallenberg had begun his work of distributing Schutzpasses, the protective Swedish papers that we heard about, to as many Jews as possible. What started in lines in offices grew to handing out passes on top of cattle cars destined to Auschwitz while shots were fired in his direction. A very few desperate and lucky hands narrowly clutched these precious documents and saved themselves from imminent murder. Marika doesn't remember how or when her father came home briefly from his forced labor unit, but she does remember his excitement as he shared the precious Schutzpasses he had received for his family. And at the time, none of them even understood the gift of these papers. Marika and her mother moved to an even more cramped building in front of the Danube River, one of the designated Wallenberg safe houses. Rudy was still in the hospital, and her father, having returned to the labor force, was soon transported to the concentration camp Bergen-Belsen. Marika, her mother, and later Rudy shared one room with another family. Every single room housed 2 or 3 families. There was no cooking, but a small amount of food was provided along with the protection of the papers and the address. Marika remembers eating nothing but onions, and she tells me that's why she likes spicy food today. Each day, all of the residents lined up to be counted and organized into groups. Like the protection of the Schutzpasses, daily she witnessed friends and neighbors be taken away, some to the gas chambers of Auschwitz, others to the Danube River, where they were tied 2 together, and one was shot into the river, drowning the second. For Marika, there was always the fear that they would be next. Marika's story is more. It's the sum of many more unfathomable events. But the light in the darkness was the protection she and her family received from Raoul Wallenberg. Over the years, I've thought so much about these 2 people that they never met, and yet he impacted her life so profoundly. An act of pure altruism has such power, even without knowing the recipient of the gift. When the war ended, Marika's father did not return. And without word, they realized he had likely been murdered in Bergen-Belsen. Marika, Rudy, and Margie were refused access to their own home, so they returned to the apartment they received in the earlier exchange. Marika remembers playing outside one day when a strange man approached. As he came closer, little Marika recognized her father. Shouting at the top of her lungs for her mother and her brother, Marika's core family was reunited. Once home, Shandor returned to the original apartment and demanded its return. While the great majority of Marika's extended family was all murdered, that the core survived intact is nothing short of a miracle. Later, Margit and Shandor had another little girl, and Kathy was the child of a post-war promise. Wallenberg didn't need to know the individuals he was saving. It didn't matter. I suspect if you had asked him years before he moved to Hungary, he would have never imagined himself capable of doing the things he did. I bet he was an ordinary guy like all the rest of us. And when his values were challenged, he couldn't stand by. Probably he imagined he would do small things, and in the end, one step at a time, his acts of courage grew greater and greater. Still, the very first pass he handed out, likely done in the safety of an office, hidden from view, would have been enough. Everything, every single extra pass he distributed was a bonus, another whole world of change. I believe most heroes aren't born, they're self-created. Whether out of tragedy or joy, people act altruistically and heroically if they're inspired. With the right lens to filter our world, we all have it within ourselves to be heroic. While I hope all of you find a connection to Marika's story, I especially want to challenge the students among us. I suggest you all are superheroes in the making. I can't even imagine how challenging your last year of school has been and what kind of new lenses you all now have to use in your lives to help you navigate and understand all of the craziness of these past months. And while I bet you have plenty of sadness and frustration, I hope you've been safe and inspired. Wallenberg and the pandemic are a reminder that heroism doesn't always happen when you stand on top of a cattle car destined for Auschwitz. It happens sometimes just by going to work or school through small acts of kindness, as the ambassador said. We have been reminded that we are surrounded by heroes, maybe some of your mothers and fathers, the nurses, the doctors, ambulance drivers, grocery store workers, sanitation crews, and especially the teachers. Watching the news these days, it's so easy to fall into a dark hole of despair that makes it seem impossible to think beyond ourselves, let alone what we could be doing to help somebody else. I always remind students that seemingly impossible mountains of change are really just individual acts of kindness, heroism, layered one atop another that build new and better mountain ranges. I believe education is the single most important lens we have. The opportunity to learn to deliberately, intentionally, and critically filter information is the single greatest hope for change. Consent to Citizenship Education, a project very personal to me, is a vaccine against hate in a world where we truly understand the importance of a vaccination. Educators and historians will recall Raoul Wallenberg's greatness. Books have been written about a man who inspired the expression, "The Power of One." He's both a piece of history, a reminder, and a call to action. But to me, Raoul Wallenberg is so very much more. We celebrate Raoul Wallenberg Day, January 17th. This is the last day he was seen before being captured by the Russians. Well, 65 years ago yesterday, to the day, a little boy was born in Budapest. That little boy made Marika a mother. Marika and her family escaped in the middle of the night on foot to Canada in 1956 during the Russian Revolution. That little boy grew up, and later he married a Canadian girl from the prairies and made me a wife. Raoul Wallenberg didn't just save hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews. He saved one. Because of that, I've been married for over 36 years, have 3 amazing children with wonderful partners, and hopefully if they're listening, one day I'll be a grandmother. Shandor and Margit's legacy, despite Hitler's best effort, will endure. I hope to leave you motivated by the possibility of change, that each one of us can and does have the ability to make a difference. While the impact may seem too small to be worthy, looked at from a greater vantage point, we can all be part of creating healthy, strong, resilient communities. I implore you, polish your lenses and become the kind of heroes we so desperately need. I know you will find your own motivation. For me, thanks to Raoul Wallenberg, this will forever be mine. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you very much, Heather. Adam, I think we have some questions coming in. There's a question from Sarah Stone's class, her Saskatoon Public School class. Sarah is one of our consensus teachers, one of the first ones. The question is, what were the Schutz passes? What did they mean? And the second part of the question is, what else did Wallenberg do? And I'm just going to answer the latter part because I understand that Wallenberg also created a network of safe havens, hospitals, nurseries, safe houses, and soup kitchens in Budapest. And he offered shelter and protection to those Jews fleeing the persecution of the Nazis and their mass murder machine. But I'm going to let the ambassador, perhaps just to amplify what the Schutz Pass was and anything else that Wallenberg did. The other thing I'd challenge Sarah's class to do is you should probably do a little research on this and really understand the immensity and the way that Wallenberg was driven to do absolutely everything he could and how he actualized that. Ambassador Raoul, do you have any further comments on Wallenberg's actions?
Thank you very much. Regarding these protective passports, it's actually quite simple that they were printed locally in Budapest. They had no value whatsoever. This was an idea that Raoul Wallenberg and Per Anger actually made up at the legation in Budapest. So they decided that we print something that looks very official and says, Schutzpasse, and tell everyone at the Nazi, people that are there that these people are protected by Swedish law. And Raoul Wallenberg had them in his portfolio, walking around and, went to the railway station and handed out these Schutzpasses to people that were transported by the Nazis to Auschwitz and other places. So it was actually a piece of paper with a stamp on from the Swedish embassy saying this person is protected because he has or she has a Swedish Schutzpass. So it was actually a creative idea of telling the Nazis that these people are, Swedes, but in reality they were not. But that was the way how he actually, you know, managed to save 10,000s of Jews in Budapest. So that what it was. But the teacher is also right in asking the questions about this Sweden houses or this protective homes and places in Budapest, because he also worked very hard with that and finding places in Budapest where people could hide from the Nazis. And some of them were at least called the Sweden houses or Sweden homes, where people could take, you know, be in a safe haven. So you know, what they were doing was actually using their creativity and the imagination of finding ways of cheating the Nazis and telling them that, you know, these are Swedes, you should not do anything harmful against them, because then you are making a problem in the relationship with Sweden and the Swedish government. That's the full story about the Schutzpass. Maybe Heather has something extra to say about it.
Sorry. No, nothing particular. Just from a personal perspective, or from my mother-in-law's personal perspective, was just the power that they afforded. Now, this was close to the end of the war, and maybe for Miss Stone's students, Jews had been mass murdered all across the entire continent. Hungary was one of the last countries to be occupied. So this effort was especially extraordinary because Hitler's killing machine was very, very well prepared at this point. And any Jews taken out of Hungary at this time mostly went directly to their death. So the opportunity to be given a little protection was always extraordinary, but in particular at this time of the war, when all the death camps were firing at 150%, if I could use a very bad expression, these papers were especially precious.
I believe also Wallenberg, in a conversation with the German general in charge at Budapest, warned that general that he would be charged with war crimes post the war. And they knew that the Russians were coming, and that had an impact on that general. So, I mean, he stood up to power directly. It's a very interesting story and lots of history, and it's a great class exercise to do some research on Wallenberg.
Can I just say something, Judge David? So the little girl, Marika, she's watching right now. My mother-in-law is watching, and she just sent me a message saying how meaningful this is and how proud she is, and what a great opportunity this is to share her story. So I just needed to acknowledge that little girl who also just had a birthday.
I think I see there are some questions. Adam, do you want to put a question to the panelists there? Some of them are up, and anybody who wants to ask a question, just go to the chat and put forward your question.
Okay. First question is, if you look around the world, as a simple example, for example, what happened in the U.S. recently, hatred is on the rise. You know, what can be done to combat this rise, and what is being done, and what can be done?
Ambassador, do you want to answer that first? Small question.
Yeah, there is my mic on again. Perfect. Yeah, I agree that we can see that hate is on the rise, discrimination is on the rise. You know, human rights are actually trampled upon daily around the world. And I'm very frustrated myself, and let me be a little bit personal here, not kind of diplomatic, since I also was a politician once upon a time. You know, I came into Swedish Parliament in '94. I was 29 years old when I was elected, so I was pretty young. I stayed there for many years until I became the Speaker of the Parliament. But in '94, when I was elected, you know, the world was a totally different place. The Soviet Union was gone. The Cold War era was gone. Everyone was extremely happy, feeling that we don't need to spend money into the war machinery any longer. It will be an eternal peace. Countries were eager to become democratic. We saw a democratic revolution around the world where country after country wanted to be democratic. We organized election observation team because these countries were so eager to show that they are getting away from dictatorship into democracy. So we went there and we said, yeah, look, it's a better election than last time, but you can still do some things better next time, and everyone was, yeah, let's do it in a more democratic way. And unfortunately, the last years, we have seen the democracies backpedaling. There are fewer countries that are democratic today than it was 5 years ago. So it's going in the wrong direction. And there is, of course, lots of explanations. But I know one thing, and that is also from when I was a young kid and I was an active social democrat. It's a center-left party in Sweden. And we had a meeting with old leaders like Bruno Kreisky, who was an Austrian leader of the Social Democrats. And he actually, during the Nazi time, he was in Stockholm, escaping from the Nazis. And when I was young, it was also kind of this kind of attitude in the world as well. So I asked Bruno Kreisky in this meeting, and I don't know, maybe I was 17 years old or something like that. And I asked Bruno Kreisky, when do you think this wave of hate and discrimination is going away? And he looked at me and said, there is no natural law that it will go away. It depends on you. And he pointed at me and said, it depends on you. If you stand up and do the right stuff and you take the debate and you fight back, that's the only way when this wave is going in the other direction. And that's what I think is the answer here, that, there is no magic formula. It's actually that you and I, we stand up and say, no, this is not the right way forward for humanity. We need to fix another way than just keep on this hate and discrimination and racism that we see today. We need to do it in another way. So it's up to us to fight back. In a political term, though, I would like to say that we are living in a very kind of hyper-capitalistic society. We are living in a globalization that we have never seen before. Wealth is created enormously, but there are lots of people that are feeling left behind, and they feel frustrated. So there is also a political element here that I really think it's important for us to consider, that how should political leaders all over the world really find a way to make globalization works for everyone, so people can feel secure, that they can feel happy with the situation. Because I think that is one part of this, that people are feeling left behind, and they see that the rich people are getting richer. You had a 1% movement in United States not that long ago, people demonstrating and criticizing it. And now you had another group of people storming the Capitolium. So of course something is going on in the societies, and it's really important, I think, for our political leaders to come up with ideas how to make this globalization and this free capitalism that we are living in work for more people.
Yeah. Something about that really made me think. I agree a lot about what you said about leaving people out and how we need to identify people who left out. I want to mention a few things, and maybe Judge Arnott, you can remember the date. The last census, it's been a while, identified that among hate crimes in Canada, that there has been in the last years, and I think it was 2018, a significant increase in hate crimes. And the single greatest hate crime in the country was anti-Semitism. A Jewish community represents less than 1% of the Canadian population, but we were the greatest percentage of hate crimes in the country. That is alarming and disturbing, and clearly something that needs to be addressed. Obviously, all of us are watching the news, and how could we not notice on January 6th when there was obvious racism displayed towards African Americans and Jews. The Camp Auschwitz signs were staggering, and I think took the breath away of many of us. but I don't think these people just appeared. And I think, Ambassador, you filled in that piece. They didn't just appear. They've always been there. They've been given a voice. And my son, Noah, who's probably on this call, and all of you have probably heard this many times, but it bears repeating. Noah was head of the Jewish youth group at Western University. Now he's been a lawyer for a few years, so this was his first degree. So you do the math, it was a long time ago, and he received a death threat. So as a Jewish person, the death was kill Noah the Jew. And so this was a long time ago. We gave them a voice, and I think the responsibility, and that's why I mentioned, obviously, my pet project, Consent to Citizenship Education specifically, but education in general, is the only response. The only thing we can do is be louder than them. I'm not sure how much we can inform change for those people who wear horns and have face paint and storm Capitol buildings. But all of us, I know there's still enough of a population that if we make a concerted effort to educate our next generation and we make our voices louder and our acts of kindness pile on top of each other to really make the kind of change we're talking about. And it has to stop being an ideal conversation. It has to become a reality. I believe also we need
I actually would like to add one thing though, since I've been in politics for many, many years. It is a big difference, the time before social media and the time after social media. When I was a speaker of Swedish Parliament, we organized a work to see, what kind of threats and what kind of harassments did the politicians feel when they were doing their political work. And for the first part, it was 90% of the threats and dirty talks and terrible sexism was against female politicians. It was not as much at all against male politicians. But it's obvious that, if you go back 25, 30 years back in time, a person who have this kind of crazy ideas were pretty alone somewhere out there, couldn't connect easily with people that thought the same stupid ideas. But with the social media and internet, they can now go online, they Google, and they suddenly find a friend in Australia or in China, wherever, and they feel like, yeah, look, we are so many who have this kind of wonderful conspiracy theories that I have, and why can't the rest of the world be smart as we are? So you really have a lot of people connecting with stupid ideas, and now they feel strengthened by this, that they can actually communicate with themselves in the social media, and they can also use the social media and spread their hate. And we really need to think carefully about, because social media has a lots of good things to it, but here is one part that we really need to think through, how we can get it into a more mature conversation and talk to each other instead of spreading hate, as you can see in whatever Twitter feed you are looking at today.
Yeah, and if one more on top of, so I know Ms. Barr is also here with her students. This does mean that I think today's teachers, a very important part of conversations in classrooms needs to be how we engage responsibly with our cell phones and all that entails. I agree.
I'm not sure if we have any other questions coming in. I'd just like to say a couple of things in comments, and maybe the ambassador and Heather have a couple of comments. There's no doubt that democracy is fragile, and we've seen that very recently. I think governments need to invest in education. With respect to social media, in Canada, it's more or less unregulated. The agency is the CRTC, but it needs more teeth. And the platforms, the social media platforms, need to be much more responsible than they have been in the past. There's some platforms, Twitter, and others in the United States, Facebook, that are now taking some responsibility, but the evidence for the need of that was demonstrated, recently in the United States. So the importance of the the 1930s in Germany are all around us. And we need to be vigilant and very guarded and make sure that these avenues are not used any further in furtherance of the kind of hate that's being promoted. One thing I'd like to also tell everybody, and I believe we need to be intentional, explicit, and very sequential from K to 12 to inculcate in the hearts and minds of students the need to respect every citizen without exception. And in Canada, we have 5 essential citizenship competencies. We want all students to be engaged, empowered, ethical, and enlightened, but most importantly, empathetic. We have to have an understanding created, as the ambassador said, people have been left behind. When you leave people behind, are consequences, and ignorance is a major factor in the spread of hate, and it must be addressed. Well, today we've had a great opportunity to hear from a great panel. Thank you very much, Ambassador Urban Alleyne, and thank you very much, Heather Fenyes. I've heard Heather's story before, but it never fails to bring tears into the eyes of the audience that hear that story. It's so remarkable and so poignant. And I'm happy to know that Mariko is on this courageous conversation today, commemorating Raoul Wallenberg. I now would like to give to our 2 speakers the highest honor we can give from the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission. This is a leather-bound book called Words Matter, and how prophetic that title is in today's world. Words Matter is a compilation of 2 things: the factum or argument made by Grant Sharfstein from Saskatoon in the Supreme Court of Canada on the hate speech case. And the hate speech case is in this, and there's an amazing congruence between the arguments made by Grant Sharfstein and the judgment by the Supreme Court of Canada, which details in great, well-articulated words the indicia of hate in Canada. So it's not ambiguous. It's very clear. This was a unanimous decision of the Supreme Court of Canada, and it's the greatest contribution the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission has ever made to Canadian jurisprudence. And as I say, words have the power to maim, shame, and blame. And we need to be careful that that words that are used as weapons are few and far between. And we can do that through education. So, Ambassador Alleyne, thank you very much for your articulate and intelligent, passionate presentation here today. This book will be sent to you soon. Thanks for being a champion for human rights, and thanks for contributing to our commemoration of Raoul Wallenberg on this very important day. And to Heather Fenyes, thank you very much, Heather, for your passion, your wise words, and your incredible communication skills, which were on display here today. All the good work you do in the Saskatchewan community and in Canada. So with that, I want to thank everybody for participating here today. I have this gift for both of you, Heather and Urban. And we thank all the participants. I think we had 120 or so participants. Thank you to the students and teachers who came online. And thank you all the people who were able to hear this presentation. And thank you for everybody who keeps Raoul Wallenberg in their mind when they hear and have a chance or an opportunity to correct people who are ill-informed. So with that, I want to thank everybody for coming today, and I really appreciate the effort that the ambassador made and the effort that Heather made to make this day special once again.